But I asked him that we can hold that's right. So then he did yeah, so okay, it's the final case of the year. Behind the tools. Everybody hear me okay? Good. All right, well, good afternoon. It's great to see everyone back here after our summer break. I hope you all have had a wonderful summer. I know our friend Ian, he's been to some battlefields. Did anyone make it to any battlefields this summer? I think I made it to 8 by my count. And it was my first visit to Fort Fisher. I've never been there. If you haven't been, it's an incredible sight. I was really impressed. For anyone here who is new, this is our welcome to our second Saturday Civil War series. We hold this lecture series every month, January through March, May through June, and September through November. The only months we take off there are July and August for our summer break, and December for the holidays. If you have not visited Captain Thomas SB Post before, it's located just over my right shoulder, right outside these doors. The SB Post is open every weekend, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. for tours with our docents. They'd be happy to give you a tour. Chuck is our docent today. He does a great job. And speaking of docents, if anyone here is interested in becoming a docent of Captain Thomas SB Post, I am sure you warm bodies. Had a few retirements this summer, and Diane, one of our volunteers, will be leaving us soon. We'll talk about that in a moment. So if anyone here is particularly interested in Civil War history in general, if you like talking to the general public, this is a great opportunity to show off the building, show off Captain Thomas SB Post, the incredible artifacts that we have in there. anyway, it's as frequently or as infrequently as you like. So if anyone here is really interested in perhaps becoming a docent, please see me after the talk here, and I'll be happy to talk with you about that. As I mentioned, one of the docents we'll be losing later this month is one of our longest tenured, one of our favorites, Diane Kleinfelder. Yeah. Diane's moving south. She's headed down to South Carolina to be closer to her children, to her grandchildren. Many of you know Diane has been one of the smiling faces here at the Andrew Carnegie Free Library Music Hall for a very long time. She was the longtime library director. She oversaw the restoration of the Captain Thomas Espy Post, helped to raise the profile of the Espy Post to a truly national and international level. She conserved funds she applied for and received grants and secured funds to help conserve several of the fragile artifacts that you see on display in the Captain Thomas Espy Post. And speaking of artifacts, just a few months ago, we were awarded one of the American 250 PA grants through the state of Pennsylvania for $10,000 to restore 2 of the fragile textiles from the Espy Post. We have a vest that was worn by Lieutenant George Drake of the 77th Pennsylvania, and we have a cloak that was worn by George Freeman of the 62nd Pennsylvania, a very, very rare cloak, only 2 known examples of that surviving. With those funds, we will match those with funds that we've raised here through our raffles, through donations, through money that we've raised through the symposium. And over the next about 10 months or so, those textiles will be conserved, and by next summer will be back on display in the Espy Post for the first time in a very long time. I just took them over to a Washington, D.C. conservator about a month ago, and she'll be working on those over the next 10 months or so. But back to Diane. Diane also started the second Saturday Civil War series 11 years ago today. Was the very first lecture. So today marks the 88th lecture in this series, which has drawn some incredible historians here to our hilltop, thousands of visitors. Diane created our Civil War Symposium back in 2015. We welcomed over 200 people to the symposium earlier this year from 14 states and from Canada. All of this is that we're just continuing to build on the foundation, a very solid foundation that Diane has set for us. Diane also built the largest Civil War reference collection in the Allegheny County system. Dare I say, the largest Civil War collection of any library of comparable size here. All of the major research sets, thousands of volumes. We continue to add to it each and every month. And this collection has benefited researchers and historians and just the general public from Western Pennsylvania here and from beyond. So it's an incredible collection. Diane's fingerprints are all over this building, top to bottom, inside and out. She brought me on here 15 years ago as a young graduate student, an intern. She brought me back almost 5 years ago to take over as Espy Post curator. She is my mentor. She is one of my dearest friends. Even in retirement, she is in this building more often than I am. And I am already feeling a little lost knowing that she's leaving. So for all of us who have appreciated and enjoyed the Civil War programming here at the Andrew Carnegie Free Library Post, for those of us who visit the Espy Post, for anyone who borrows or references any of our books downstairs in our collection, we all owe a great deal of gratitude for the blood, sweat, and tears that Diane has poured into this building. So Diane, on behalf of all of us, thank you, thank you, thank you. Got Diane some flowers here. We did a little bit better on our snack game there today. We got some Bethel Bakery and coffee. You all will have to be very kind to me with coffee moving forward, because Diane has made it every month. I don't drink coffee. I don't know how to make coffee. We'll figure it out together. Unless Diane decides that she doesn't want to move, that's fine too. All right. So now switching gears, and I have more announcements than usual this morning, so just bear with me, but I do have our raffle winners as well. It's Diane's last official duty here was to draw the winners, so yell at her if you did not win. But our raffle winners for today are General John Reynolds, Mark Lake, Andy, and Russ. You all can claim your books in the back over there. Thank you for supporting our raffle. Now switching gears, it's become something of a tradition in September that we announce our lineup of speakers for the next year, as well as announce our symposium. So just bear with me and we will get to our speaker here in just a few minutes. We will get you home in time. WQ15 today. But I worked over the spring, over the summer, to put together our monthly lineup. I think we have some great speakers lined up for next year, so I hope we'll continue to come back. Looking ahead to next month, October 11th, we have one of my very favorite Civil War historians, Jonathan Noyalis. He's a professor at Shenandoah University. He's director of the McCormick Civil War Center there. He will be here to discuss his newest book, which I believe will be out in time for his talk here next month. But he will look at General Phil Sheridan in life, war, and memory. So that's what his topic of his book is as well. That should be an outstanding talk. He's a wonderful historian. He should have several of his other books here for sale with him as well. Closing out the year in November, we have Judge William Vaudry coming down from Cleveland to speak on the war that never was, Great Britain, the U.S., and the Trent Affair. Judge Vaudry is also a law professor, so I think he has a unique insight on the political diplomatic implications of the Trent Affair in November 1861. We'll be off for the month of December like usual. We will come back in January with Ron Kirkwood. He's written several award-winning books on the Spangler Farm at Gettysburg. We'll be discussing George Spangler Farm's critical role at the Battle of Gettysburg. In February, we have another Ron coming. That's Ron Coddington. He will be here to discuss his book, African American Faces of the Civil War. Ron is the editor of Military Images magazine. He's a good friend, so that should be a terrific talk. In March, we will have Katie Wolf here to discuss women at war, the home front, the hospital, and the battlefield. Now, Katie was one of the speakers here earlier this year when we had kind of the group talk with the 62nd Pennsylvania. I was especially impressed with her. So she'll be sharing some of the research that she has been doing. One thing to note for this lecture, March, we will meet on the first Saturday of the month rather than the second. I have tried to hold talks here over St. Patrick's Day weekend in the past. I think people like to drink beer because it's been a little sparse. So we're going to try to meet on the first weekend so you all can enjoy St. Patrick's Day the following. In April, we will have our symposium, and I'll get back to that in a moment. In May, we'll have David Welker here to discuss his forthcoming book on the Invalid Corps, or the Veteran Reserve Corps. David has authored several books over the years, including one that I really enjoyed on the Battle of Chantilly. In June, we'll have John L. Hopkins here to discuss his book, The World Will Never See the Like, Gettysburg Reunion of 1913. John received a really favorable review in Wall Street Journal for this book, so that should be a good talk. We'll take our usual break in July and August. We'll return next September, 1 year from this weekend, with our good friend of mine, Hunter Lesser. We'll be here to discuss Robert E. Lee's feuding generals, Henry Wise versus John Floyd. These guys were two former Virginia governors who could not stand the sight of one another. It's a really, I've heard this talk before, it's really entertaining, and Hunter is a great presenter as well. Next October, we will welcome Dominish Miller, a historian from York County, Pennsylvania, and she will discuss the not-so-invisible women, the Daughters of Charity at Gettysburg, and their role as nurses following the battle. And then closing out next year in November, we'll have another good friend, Scott Patchen, here to discuss Abraham Lincoln and the Shenandoah Valley, 1862 and 1864. We're comparing how Lincoln's perceptions and involvement with the general in command of the Shenandoah Valley evolved between 1862 and 1864. I think that's a pretty solid lineup of speakers, so I hope you all will come out and continue supporting these programs. Now, looking ahead to next April, our symposium will be held on Friday and Saturday, April 17th and 18th. I mentioned earlier that previously at this year's symposium, I announced that our theme for next year will be 1861, Small Battles, Big Outcomes. 1861 is typically overlooked in favor of later years of the war, larger battles, larger armies, higher casualties. But the first year of the Civil War witnessed many advances, setbacks, trials, tribulations, personalities, decisions that really affected how the remainder of the Civil War was going to be fought. So in this symposium, we will unpack the military, the political, and the social threads from this pivotal first year of the war. So for our lineup, we will have some old friends from symposia past, as well as some new friends joining us. Chris Bukowski will be back to discuss the Battle of Belmont and the rise of Ulysses S. Grant. Chris was here back in 2022. You'll recall he's the co-founder, editor-in-chief at Emerging Civil War. He's the author of about 15,000 books, including a new one on Ulysses S. Grant. Always an entertaining presenter, so we'll look forward to having him back. Rich Condon, Pittsburgh Kid, will be back to discuss the Year of Jubilee, Battle for Port Royal, and the birth of Reconstruction. Rich is with the National Park Service and previously worked at Reconstruction era historical park. Mark Malloy, another historian with the National Park Service. He's with the George Washington Memorial Parkway and the Arlington House. Will be here to lecture on the severe struggle of his life, Robert E. Lee's decision at Arlington House, which Lee opted to resign his commission and cast his lot with Virginia and the Confederacy. Melissa Wynn from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine will be here to talk about healing open wounds, how First Manassas transformed medical care, in which she'll look at the innovations that were spawned from the lack of preparedness for a battle, the scale of what these soldiers experienced at First Manassas. Rob Morrison with Prince William County Historic Preservation will be back in 2026 to talk about early actions on the Potomac River, the skirmishes, the battles, the personalities relating to the Confederate efforts to blockade the Potomac River from the summer of 1861 through early 1862. Ryan Quint, National Park Service Ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania, will be here to discuss the Battle of Drainesville, December 1861. Ryan put out a terrific book on Drainesville just last year. That was an important battle for Pittsburgh. You had a lot of Pittsburgh soldiers that were there that were involved in that battle. So he will talk about Pennsylvania reserves at Drainesville. I used to work on the Drainesville battle, a business located on the Drainesville battlefield about 20 years ago. So this has always been a particular interest of mine. Really enjoyed his book. That should be a great talk as well. Phil Spoggy, an editor with Military Images Magazine and just an all-around good guy, will be here to discuss Arming the Boys of 61, origins, differences, and challenges of arming Union soldiers. His lecture will include an exhibit of more than a dozen original firearms relating to his talk and arming Union soldiers at the outbreak of the war. We'll also have a historians panel here that Chris Bukowski will moderate. We'll record that for the Emerging Civil War podcast. So that'll be kind of like what we did earlier this year with John Banks and Tom McMillan and the Antietam and Beyond podcast. In partnership with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and Military Images Magazine, will also host a traveling exhibit on faces of Civil War nurses. This exhibit was most recently at the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers office in Washington, D.C. Just packed up from there just a few weeks ago. It includes 20 life-sized images of Civil War nurses with accompanying interpretation on each nurse. This is a really dynamic exhibit. Really excited to see it because one of the images these images for this exhibit were pulled from Ron Coddington's book on Civil War nurses. One of the images in that book and one of the images selected for this exhibit was an image that I gave Ron of Sister Ignatius Marley, who served in Wheeling Hospital during the Civil War just south of here. So I'm really excited to see this as well. Arsenal Cider, Pittsburgh Sycamore themed hard cider distillery, will be back for tastings and bottle sales. We will have our usual raffles, book sales, want some hors d'oeuvres again on Friday evening in a cash bar, and then breakfast and lunch on Saturday and some snacks during the day. Ticket sales just opened this morning. You're the first people to hear about it, but somehow we already sold one ticket. We'll keep those open through the first week of April. So if anyone would like a ticket today, we can do that after the program. You can also get tickets on our website. You can get them anytime downstairs at the circulation desk. Ticket prices this year are $95. With the service charge that gets added on, it comes out to $100. I tried to make it that is all inclusive as I could. So that's only a very slight increase over our ticket price from earlier this year. Food prices continue to go up. But like I said, I try really hard to keep our prices as low as possible so the symposium is accessible to everyone. I'm sure you could go elsewhere. You could find a lineup like that and pay a lot more money to see it. So I appreciate all of your support as we continue to grow this event from the little symposium that could to one of the premier Civil War conferences in the country. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to speak with me after the program here. And I think that's the last of our announcements. So thank you for bearing with me. Today we're joined by Matt Borders, a graduate of Michigan State and Eastern Michigan University. Matt holds a BA in United States history with a focus on the American Civil War and an MS in historic preservation. Following graduation, he taught at Kalamazoo Valley Community College before accepting a position with the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. He worked as the historian for the ABPP for 6 years, during which time he became a certified battlefield guide at Antietam and Harpers Ferry. He's also the president of the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable and a founding member of the Antietam Institute. Currently, he's a park ranger at Monocacy National Battlefield in Frederick, one of my favorite little Civil War battlefields out there. If anyone hasn't been to Monocacy, you really got to go check it out on your way to Baltimore or DC or Gettysburg, just south of Gettysburg. He, along with fellow Antietam guide Joe Stahl, published 4 books in their Faces of Union Soldiers series, which looks at federal soldiers at a variety of battles, their stories, and their regiments. Matt does have copies of several of the books for sale today in the back of the room. Takes cash and credit card. Wonderful books, outstanding historians. I do hope that you will consider taking home a copy with you. He's here today to talk to us about Western Pennsylvania soldiers and regiments in the Maryland campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Borders.
Thank you everyone for having me here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and a long time coming. John Eric very graciously invited me last year, but due to a scheduling issue that I had come up, I was not able to join y'all. So I very much appreciate the second invitation, and it's wonderful to be here with you at the beginning of your 88th season, or excuse me, 88th lecture, not season. You'll get to season, I promise. Today we're going to be looking at, as John Eric said, Western Pennsylvanians in the Maryland campaign. Now, the title I chose for this talk is Hearts Strong and We're Unshaken, which is a quote that comes from the 125th Pennsylvania Infantry's history regarding their actions at Antietam. Of course, we will be focusing primarily on Antietam today. It is the big fight in the Maryland campaign, as you guys are aware, but we are also going to touch on the other engagements in this campaign as well, specifically Southbound and the Battle of Shepherdstown. Now, I'm going to try to not move around too much. I'm a park ranger, as John Eric said, and I do have a tendency to wander as I talk, but I'm going to try to stay right here behind the lectern to give this presentation and to stay within our audio-visual elements. But jumping into it, I do want to do a little bit with context. So, Pennsylvania has a unique role in the American Civil War. It is the first to defend, in many ways, the cause of the United States, the cause of the Union. Of course, on April 15th, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion to preserve the Union. Pennsylvania was to supply 14 regiments. That's what their initial quota was. There is such a massive turnout from the state of Pennsylvania, that would lead to 29 regiments being formed, and this is before the PA reserves are involved. The governor at the time is a significant supporter. Curtin is I shouldn't say significant, he's an extreme supporter of the federal government and is pushing these enlistments, pushing the development of these regiments, and he would dramatically support even the development of PA reserves, even more of his fellow Pennsylvanians in the service. The first defenders, of course, famously 500 volunteers that are raced to Washington, D.C., but there was also an ask for an immediate deployment of 2 full regiments to the national capital, which Pennsylvania provided, and then, of course, the 15 regiments of the Pennsylvania Reserves. Now, let's look at the big numbers, though, for Pennsylvania before we jump in. And I promise, we are going to touch on Western Pennsylvania specifically. But 387,284 men in just the Army served in the state of Pennsylvania. If we include the Navy, it's over 420,000 in the state. 270 different units, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and others from Pennsylvania. 81 regiments from Western Pennsylvania alone, 19 of which serve at Antietam in some facet. We're not going to look at every single one of those today, but we're going to look at a good chunk of them. And of course, 11 regiments of United States colored troops would also serve from Pennsylvania. Over 8,600 soldiers in the USCT, Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is definitely doing its job throughout the American Civil War. As most of you are well aware, it is the highest contributor to the United States war effort until the draft, and then New York bumps up a little bit over it. But Pennsylvania, the number 2 for the most soldiers going into the Union war effort. But let's dive into our talk today. And I want to give a little bit of context with what's going on in 1862. So at the beginning of the year, we have what's known as the Peninsula Campaign. United States forces are going to get down onto the Virginia Peninsula and are going to begin working their way up the peninsula towards the Confederate capital at Richmond. Now, this is going to begin in March of 1862, and this campaign has been referred to as a war of engineering. Every time Confederate forces attempt to hold a defensive line, attempt to hold a city or fortification on the peninsula, vast federal resources are brought to bear against it. And those Confederate troops are forced to withdraw or be cut off and potentially destroyed. The digging in that goes on during this campaign, the fortifications that are developed by both United States and Confederate forces are extensive, but the campaign is working. It's moving slower than, say, the Lincoln administration would have preferred, that's for sure. But it is working. It is driving Confederate forces back upon their capital, and supposedly by the end of May, United States forces, particularly the officers, are, as they would say, setting their watches by the tolling of Richmond's bells. That's how close they're getting to the capital, within 5 miles of Richmond. Of course, at the very end of May, we would have the Battle of 7 Pines, May 31st to June 1st, 1862. This would have George McClellan going up against what I would say is the best defensive commander in the Confederacy, bar none, Joseph Johnston. Johnston is going to be very badly wounded at this engagement. He's hit by both small arms fire and shell fragments. He obviously cannot command anymore, and taking over for him, of course, will be Robert E. Lee. Now, we know Lee from his 63 reputation and onward. Many of us think of his old Army reputation, a good reputation going into the American Civil War, but his Civil War career up to this point has been very lackluster. He's been involved in 2 separate Confederate defeats in what's now West Virginia. He has been surveying the Carolina coastline. He's a military engineer after all, so fortifications, that sort of thing. And he's been the military advisor to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. And that connection is really what's going to place Lee in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia. And it's during this period that Lee actually begins to build the largest army he will ever command, around 90,000 troops. He will strip the Carolina coastline, of most of its defenders. The Shenandoah Valley will have its defenders removed as well. We would see Confederate troops being brought into Richmond and its immediate area from all points. And with this massive force that he is building, he will launch a blistering counteroffensive at the end of June of 1862, known as the 7 Days. The 7 Days, as the name implies, is fought over about a week. About 6 or so engagements, fought over the course of a week. In almost every one of those fights that Western Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania as a whole are heavily involved in almost every one of those fights, United States forces will do more damage to the Confederates than they themselves receive. But they are so thrown off by this sudden aggressive action, this massive counterattack by Confederate forces, that they're going to begin to withdraw. And that's what we're seeing here on this wartime map, a series of falling back, eventually down to a fortified camp on the James River known as Harrison's Landing. Harrison's Landing was a massive federal camp. The entire Army of the Potomac is concentrated there. The Federals have earthworks there, they have their guns there. And almost as importantly, look off there in the distance. The United States Navy is on the James River with their even bigger guns. So if you're Robert E. Lee, are you going to throw your forces at something like this? Probably not. I see a few heads shaking out there. I appreciate that. He's going to begin to shift north. He's going to begin what's known as the Northern Virginia Campaign. And he is going to be striking for specifically the United States Army of Virginia, established in late June of '62 under the command of John Pope. Now, Pope here has made something of a nuisance of himself. He's won in the Western Theater. He helps take Island number 10. That kind of raises his star in the eyes of the federal government. And he is brought east to command this new army that is supposed to work in conjunction with the Army of the Potomac to take Richmond. But he is also a proponent of a harder war. He is not interested in kowtowing to civilians, to protecting the rights of enslavers, to protecting Southern property. He is more than willing to strike at Confederate infrastructure, including civilian farms and things like that. And so Pope is making something of a nuisance of himself for the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee orders Pope, as he puts it, suppressed, which begins the Northern Virginia campaign. Specifically, the Battle of Cedar Mountain, fought on August 9, 1862. It's the beginning of the campaign. General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson nearly defeated at Cedar Mountain. We oftentimes don't remember that, but Nathaniel Banks nearly beats him. Unfortunately, he does not. For federal forces, they would be pushed from the field, and Jackson will be able to continue moving on towards Manassas. Banks's men would not take part in much of the rest of the campaign. Of course, Second Bull Run or Second Manassas is the big engagement of the Northern Virginia campaign. This image here portraying the rock fight or the defense of the railroad cut at Second Bull Run. Jackson's forces believed to be cut off, isolated. Pope's army goes right at him. Unfortunately, the other half of the Confederate army under James Longstreet would take Pope in the flank, leading to the collapse of the federal army, falling back through the area of Chantilly. Now, I included Chantilly on here because I do think it's an important little fight that doesn't get enough love, and this is about all that's left of the battlefield. About 4 or 5 acres, a little memorial park. We have, of course, the 2 monuments there to Isaac Stevens and Philip Kearny, the 2 federal officers, 2 federal generals that are killed or wounded at Chantilly. But it does preserve the federal retreat route. It allows the Army of Virginia to fall back successfully to Washington, D.C. and its defenses. Sadly, most of the battlefield today is under a shotgun. But Robert E. Lee has successfully, aggressively defended Virginia. He has driven back or beaten 2 different federal armies, the Army of the Potomac and the Union Army of Virginia. He has an open road north, and he will advance his forces to Leesburg, Virginia, very close to the Potomac River. And on September 4th, 1862, he would begin crossing. The Maryland campaign was fought from September 4th to the 20th of 1862. We're going to kind of touch on most of the breadth of this campaign. But this would see the two armies moving first towards my town of Frederick, Maryland. Confederate forces will concentrate in Frederick, Maryland on September 6th before moving off to the northwest on the rest of the campaign. Federal forces will be coming up in their wake. Both armies passed through that city in its entirety. But there were numerous reasons for Lee to be north of the Potomac River, the first Confederate invasion above the Potomac. Those included to keep the initiative. He's winning after all. Yes, the Army of Northern Virginia is in rough shape the summer of 62, but he wants to keep that initiative, wants to keep this ball rolling, and he knows he can't go at Washington. Remember, two different federal armies have fallen back on Washington, and those famous fortifications that were definitely involved by the time of my battle, 1864, are fully intact. They're being developed by 1862, and many of those forts have been built at that point. So he can't go right at Washington, but hopefully he can draw federal forces away from Washington and beat them somewhere else. This would tie into the belief that Lee and many of his commanders believe the Federals are not prepared for this movement above the Potomac River. Some accounts claim that Lee would have anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks where he could move through Maryland with impunity, possibly even into Pennsylvania itself, rest, resupply his forces, and choose a battlefield to receive the Federal advance. Of course, that does tie into rest and resupplying. Lee is hoping to give Northern Virginia a break during this period as well, allowing those farmers that still exist there in Northern Virginia, which has been the playground of armies for 1.5 years at this point, to bring in what crops they have for the coming winter. And to be honest, why not live off of the Marylanders for a little while? Even though the Confederates are trying to convince Maryland to join the Confederate fold, why not live off the enemy for a little bit? Of course, the political opportunities are pretty extensive. 1862 is an off-year election year in the state of Maryland and elsewhere in the federal government. There is hope that another win, this time north of the Potomac, could lead to more peace Democrats being elected to Congress that might force a negotiated truce between the two sides. In addition, I know you guys know this answer. What are the two big European powers the Confederacy has been flirting with since the war broke out? Britain and France, heard of both, very good, absolutely correct. Particularly the court of St. James, Great Britain, the hope being, of course, that if they can win again, that would lead to European recognition, and the Royal Navy would be brought in to clear the southern ports of the federal blockade and reopen those ports to international commerce. The stakes extremely high in 1862 for Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army. And all of this hinges on Lee is looking for a fight north of the Potomac. He needs that win above the Potomac River. Now, of course, as many of you guys are aware, the marching orders for the Maryland campaign would be written just outside of Frederick, Maryland, Special Order 191. Not oftentimes, or I should say too often, it is portrayed as an army-breaking piece of information, that it really was the battle plan or the very key to Lee's army. It really wasn't. It's important, but it's not earth-shattering when a copy of that is picked up by federal forces. What it does is advances the timeline, because McClellan and the Army of the Potomac was already pursuing Robert E. Lee. Was already pursuing the Army of Northern Virginia when 191 was discovered and raised up the chain of command. And that's going to lead directly to the fighting at South Mountain on September 14, 1862, because McClellan is trying to get in between the pieces of Lee's army, at the very least between the two big wings of Jackson and Longstreet, and hoping to destroy that army in detail. This is going to lead to extensive fighting at Fox's Gap, where the battle began. The Frosttown Plateau, also known as Frosttown Gap. Frampton's Gap, which is the attempt to relieve the Harpers Ferry garrison. We can see Harpers Ferry down here. And there's also fighting at Turner's Gap, which I did not circle because we actually don't have any Pennsylvania troops in the fight in Turner's Gap. So let's look at these gaps at some detail. For the 4 gaps, we have Fox Gap, which begins around 9 a.m. All morning fighting until around noon. There is a lull from noon till about 2 p.m., at which point Wilcox's division begins to advance, and this is where we have the Roundheads. 100th Pennsylvania Infantry is involved in this fight. The Battle of South Mountain was a victory for Orlando Wilcox's men. Welsh's brigade, with the Roundheads, attacked a strong Confederate line at Fox Gap and were successful in driving the enemy from the field. The assault was made over difficult terrain, requiring an advance over steep uphill country. This is from, of course, the PA, the Roundheads regiment district. But there is the 100th Pennsylvania right in the thick of the fighting. I do apologize for the angle of the map, but for those of you familiar with South Mountain, we have the Wood Road. This is moving almost directly north, and the Weiss Farm is right in here. That's basically where the small memorial park and parking area is today there at Fox Gap, if you've been able to visit that site. So the 100th PA, the Roundheads are going to go right through that area and are heavily involved in driving Confederate forces by around 9 p.m. or so from the Gap. But there's a lot more fighting on this mountain to do. Frosttown Gap, also known as Frosttown Plateau, the fighting there began around 1 p.m. in the afternoon on September 14th. And from behind every rock, tree, and log, they forced the enemy with ball and bayonet. The color bearers struggling up the mountainside, and the men rallying around the flag. Cheer after cheer resounded to the rebel valleys of the sun. Onward and upward, the fiery line rolled and surged. The bewildered rebels saw, in astonishment, the smoke and flame rising from rock to rock. Who are we talking about? The Pennsylvania Reserves. Specifically for our Western Pennsylvania Reserves, we have the 8th Pennsylvania, 8th PA Reserves, the 9th PA Reserves, the 10th, the 11th, and up there at the top on the northern edge of this battlefield is the 13th PA Reserves, the 1st Rifles, Bucktails. They are going to be acting as skirmishers throughout the fighting at South Mountain. And they are going to help drive back Robert Rhodes' division up the mountain. Excuse me, not Robert Rhodes, Daniel Harvey Hill's division, up the mountain. Rhodes is a brigade commander at this time, my apologies. And attempting to take the flank of the National Pike, which we can see right through here at Turner's Gap. The advance on Turner's Gap, because of the advances happening at Fox's Gap and Frosttown, would begin around 4 p.m. We don't have any specific Pennsylvania units circled here because we're looking at Western PA specifically, but we can see our Western PA boys up here about halfway up the mountain. They're driving back Confederate forces. There's the Wood Road that actually connects Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap. And one of my favorite units there, the Iron Brigade, helping to push back Confederate forces from Turner's Gap. Heavy fighting on this mountain, oftentimes overshadowed because it is the precursor to Antietam. One more gap I want to look at real quick, though, is of course Frampton's Gap. Of the Battle of South Mountain, I think Frampton's Gap is oftentimes one of those most easily overlooked, even though there's some wonderful interpretive markers there, and of course the war correspondence arch survives at Frampton's Gap. Often overlooked because it's very much separated from the rest of the fighting. We actually don't have any Western Pennsylvania regiments with the United States 6th Corps at Frampton's Gap, but we do have 3 companies there, interestingly enough. That regiment, however, is not specifically involved in the fighting. So I didn't go into much detail on Frampton's Gap today. This was the attempt, however, to relieve pressure and relieve the minor siege that's going on at Harpers Ferry. So this is actually Crampton's Gap right here. The gap itself, unlike the fighting elsewhere, much of the defense of Crampton's Gap was done at the base of South Mountain, right along the church road there. With federal forces successfully pushing through Confederate lines in South Mountain, this is going to force Robert E. Lee to make a decision. And initially, he is ready to throw in the towel on this whole campaign. Nothing has gone right. The timeline that he established with Special Order 191 has basically gone out the window. The federal army is bearing down on half his army at South Mountain. They've breached the South Mountain gaps. And at the end of the 14th, the Confederate Army is spread out between the two wings by about 25 miles between Harpers Ferry and South Mountain. Lee is ready to fall back. He begins to withdraw his forces, and he has actually written orders to have his men fall back entirely to Virginia by way of Shepherdstown. Soon to be Shepherdstown, West Virginia, but he's ready to throw it in. However, on the morning of the 15th of September, he is resting his forces in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And it would be at that time, as he is corresponding with Jackson's wing of the army, he would receive word that Harpers Ferry will fall that day. And when he gets that news, he decides to make a stand on Sharpsburg Ridge to buy time for his army to come back together. Now, I've made some adjustments to this historic map a little bit to bring out some of the details a little bit more for you. That's Antietam Creek, obviously, right there, the blue line. That heavy black line, that is the Sharpsburg-Hagerstown Turnpike, the main north-south road between Sharpsburg and Hagerstown. That is along essentially and we can see it in red there, the Sharpsburg Ridge. Lee decides to make his stand on Sharpsburg Ridge because not only it's high ground, obviously, he's got good fields of view, good fields of fire. He's come from east to west, so now he has basically seen the very ground his opponent will now have to cross over. He has Antietam Creek running north to south in front of his whole line, so a significant water feature. But we oftentimes hear these portrayals of Lee making a desperate stand on Sharpsburg Ridge that his back was to the Potomac River. He almost has 1 foot in it, as friends of mine like to say. That's not true at all. Robert E. Lee is not an idiot, and he has chosen his battlefield very well. Not only does he have Sharpsburg Ridge, but he has Hauser's and Real Ridge right behind that, and there's another ridge line behind that before you even get to the Potomac. He's got a good 3 to 4 miles, depending on where you are on this line, between himself and the Potomac River, and he's got several good fallback points. He has chosen this battlefield well to receive that federal advance, and now he's buying time to pull his army together. That's going to lead to a concentration of Confederate forces on the 15th and 16th. Initially, we only have a few divisions present. We're going to have Longstreet, we're going to have Hood, we're going to have at least one of the hills there, but they are buying time for the rest of the Confederate Army to come up from Harpers Ferry. On the 15th, George McClellan's Army of the Potomac begins to arrive on the east side of Antietam Creek. And he is looking at Sharpsburg Ridge. Robert E. Lee has put as much infantry and artillery on that ridge line, daring McClellan to attack it. George McClellan would later write that Sharpsburg Ridge was one of the most formidable defensive positions he had ever seen, and he had little desire to throw his troops into the teeth of that defense. Now, many folks like to point at this as the timid, McClellan being timid. I don't think that's the case, because one of McClellan's greatest detractors is there with him when he makes this observation. Joseph Hooker. General Hooker says there's at least 40,000 Confederates up on that ridgeline. There's half that, by the way. But even one of McClellan's great detractors thinks there's a whole lot of folks up there. This could be a very dangerous situation. So offensive operations begin on September 16th by shifting troops well to the north, going up over the upper bridge in the Pry Ford. That is going to allow federal forces to cross essentially unopposed onto the Confederate side of Antietam Creek and moving in from the north in hopes of taking the Confederate line in the flank. Unfortunately, that is not going to go quite as planned for United States forces. A significant skirmish would be kicked up on the evening of September 16th in what is known today as the East Woods, specifically between the Bucktails, the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, excuse me. Joseph Hooker is on the north end of the field at Poffenberger Farm. The Confederate forces defending the East Woods in that area of the battlefield at the time is John Bell Hood. And of course, Hugh McMillan there, the commanding officer of the PA, 13th PA Reserves. The reserves are going to fight very hard that evening, taking much of the East Woods, being driven back at one point, retaking parts of it again, but sadly, very near the end or beginning of this engagement, Colonel McNeil is mortally, he's killed. Supposedly, his dying words were, "Forward, Bucktails, forward." So already, Western Pennsylvania shedding its blood here at Antietam. The federal advance on September 17th is going to begin prior to 6 a.m. The fighting has begun in the northern part of the battlefield by Confederate artillery bombarding the First Corps camp on the morning of September 17th. And we will see the Pennsylvania Reserves, which have a lot of those Western PA troops we talked about, in reserve that morning. The other two divisions of the First Corps will be pushed forward first. James Ricketts had a double day. The 13th PA Reserve and some of its compatriots are still forward of the line, still down there by the East Woods, part of Seymour's brigade. They are not going to have a significant role in much of the rest of the fight at Antietam, but in the morning, they're helping to hold that line together and support the advance. The PA Reserves themselves, specifically the four regiments that we're looking at, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th, would advance eventually to the northern edge of the cornfield, where they would help stymie the advance of John Bell Hood's division, a 2,000-ish man attack that would occur in the early morning hours. They have reached the northern edge of the cornfield around 6:45 in the morning. Coming from Captain Samuel Dick of the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves, we held our fire until the enemy had advanced within 25 yards of us. Then we delivered the entire volley of the regiment, driving them back in confusion. I advanced and continued driving the enemy out of the corn, capturing 2 stand of their colors, until we came to the outer edge of the field, where we remained firing at a new brigade of the enemy, who were advancing through the open field. Roswell Ripley's Confederate advance. But the PA Reserves, specifically the 9th and the 11th, have just crushed John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade. Specifically, the 1st Texas Infantry will sustain 82.6% casualties in this attack. The 2 stands of colors that Captain Dick calls out are captured by Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson does receive the Medal of Honor. There is no known picture of Johnson that I have been able to find, but this small memorial does exist to him in Willisville, Pennsylvania. He actually is buried out in, if I'm not mistaken, Arkansas. He moves west. So the PA Reserves are doing their job already here at Antietam, but they cannot do this alone. And they are the bulwark on which the First Corps will rally upon. The First Corps fights itself to pieces, about 40% casualties across the entire corps. that morning of the 9,000 men that advanced, the Pennsylvania Reserves are the line on which they rally and are able to reestablish themselves. But this means we need reinforcements. We need additional forces to enter the field. And that would occur with the advance of the 12th Corps around 7:25 in the morning. Now, the 12th Corps is commanded by this gentleman here, Joseph K. Mansfield. Mansfield, second oldest Army officer on the battlefield at 59 years old. He commands, or has been in command, I should say, of the 12th Corps for 2 days prior to the Battle of Antietam. He has a mixed command of veteran troops that have come from the old Union Army of Virginia and inexperienced forces from the Washington garrison. So he has this mixed command. About a third, half to a third of his troops have never seen combat before. So he is moving at the head of his command, which interestingly enough, if we look at the map here, we can see them moving down the road. They're actually in column of companies. This is a very big formation. Mansfield is trying to keep his men in order, in line, and he will push forward Crawford's brigade as they advance. We have one little regiment circled down there. That is the 125th Pennsylvania Infantry. The 125th is a brand new regiment. There are 700 men on the field for that regiment alone at Antietam. It's big. The 125th, interestingly enough, is going to be supported by other Western Pennsylvanians. The 111, the 111th Pennsylvania Infantry is coming down the road as well. But they're way in the back, Steinruck's brigade. But keep that in mind, how far forward the 125th is with Crawford's brigade and how far back Steinruck's brigade is. Because these men together are going to help push through the East Woods that morning. By 9 a.m., they have pushed through not only the East Woods, but they have gained Sharpsburg Ridge, or the Sharpsburg Plateau, essentially where the visitor center is today. That blue circle you see on the map, that's Crawford's brigade, okay? Way to the north. That red circle, that's the 125th Pennsylvania. They left their brigade. They attached themselves essentially to Greene's division, which includes, I saw a Hector Tyndale shirt out there, love him, but also Steinruck's brigade. Those two brigades under Greene will make it to Sharpsburg Ridge. Of course, right across the street from Sharpsburg Ridge, right across from the visitor center today is the famous Dunker Church, one of the landmarks of the battlefield landscape. And up on that ridge line, supporting the 125th with Greene's division is the 111th Pennsylvania. Now, initially unsupported, the 125th is going to go into the West Woods, almost by itself. It will be backed up by the 84th New York here very shortly, but it will get into a heck of a firefight in the West Woods with Confederate forces, eventually being driven back out of the woods around 9:20 a.m. The lovely 125th PA monument still stands there on the edge of the West Woods today. I highly encourage you to check that out, just behind the Dunker Church. The color sergeant that is on that monument, George Simpson, is killed at Antietam. With the presence of federal forces, with Greene's division on the Sharpsburg Plateau, however, Confederate forces will attempt to dislodge them from, again, right where the visitor center is today, twice. We're going to have two significant Confederate counterattacks boiling out of the West Woods. The first one we can see here is Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade, and they're going to go right at the 111th. 111th Pennsylvania is attempting to support Tompkins Battery, Rhode Island Artillery. They came on with a yell, but fixing bayonets, our line leaped up, rushed to the very axles of the cannon, and as the latter poured forth their canister, our rifles delivered a deadly fire into the faces of the foe at less than 50 yards. Some accounts have it as closer than that, 30 yards. Kershaw's South Carolinians are thrown back with a bloody repulse. But Confederate forces are not done. we would see a second Confederate counterattack. This is Van Vanning's brigade, part of the Confederate forces that have been raced up from the area of the Burnside Bridge. Van Vanning's brigade also gets right there along the Sharpsburg-Hagerstown Turnpike, right in front of Dunkirk Church, and receive a punishing fire from Greene's division, including the 101th Pennsylvania. The repulse of Van Vanning's brigade allows for Greene to advance his forces, including the 11th Pennsylvania, excuse me, I didn't mean to advance that, including the 111th Pennsylvania, which we can see right here at the bottom of the line, into the West Woods at around 10:20, 10:30 in the morning. Throats are parched with thirst, faces blackened with smoke, lips smeared and cracked with powder from bitten partridges. The guns were so hot their brass bands were discolored, belts sagged loosely over empty stomachs, hands were swollen, and the incessant use of the ramrod. Shoulders were lamed by the recoil of pieces. But only the spirit of battle was behind the resolute jaws and the blazing eyes of that battalion of Western Pennsylvanians. Western PA doing its job, thick of the fighting here at Antietam. That comes from the 111th Pennsylvania's unit history. They will hold this vanguard position. They will hold this foothold, if you will, in the West Woods for almost 2 hours. 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending on who you read. Eventually, Greene's division will withdraw back to its line on Sharpsburg Ridge, again, pretty much right where the visitor center is. There they will be relieved by elements of the 6th Corps that have come up and are able to finally withdraw back to the East Woods. They have penetrated further and deeper into Confederate lines than any other and sustained their position longer than any other federal unit on the field that day. Fortunately for Western Pennsylvania, there are no regiments from this part of Pennsylvania in the 2nd Corps. So they will not be attacking Bloody Lane directly. But the assistance of Western Pennsylvania forces are why the attacks are able to roll forward and are eventually successful at the Summit Road. Let me explain. The United States 2nd Corps is being held in reserve for much of the morning of September 17th. General McClellan is willing to release those troops forward. Little Sumner's Corps, the 2nd Corps, but he's only willing to do so once he has someone to fill in that reserve position. Who's the reserve that's often pointed out at Antietam? 5th Corps. And the 5th Corps is coming up in fits and starts. It does contain 2 Western Pennsylvania regiments, the 67th Pennsylvania and the 83rd Pennsylvania. Both of them were present at Antietam, neither of which are going to be directly engaged in the fighting, but their presence on the field, we can see Morrell's division coming in on the field here, allows for Israel Richardson's division to be released. That 2nd Corps division is released, allowed to go to the front. Of course, Israel Richardson famously has the Irish Brigade leading the way, and they're going to be the division that helps break the Confederate position at the Summit Road. But a very interesting quote from the 67th Pennsylvania about the fighting. We can stand on the hill and see the whole thing. Sight is grand, but still, it makes one's heart ache to think of a nation fighting amongst themselves as we are. This comes from First Lieutenant Edwin Little, the 62nd Pennsylvania Infantry. As the fighting is going on, and that's important to remember, as the fighting is going on at Sumter Road, we have the fighting beginning at Burnside Bridge. What was known locally at the time as the Rohrwall Bridge or the Lower Bridge. The 100th Pennsylvania Infantry, the Roundheads, we've already met them, are going to be a contributing factor to the fighting. Not for the bridge itself, interestingly enough. Wilcox's brigade or division, excuse me, is in reserve or it's waiting. When federal forces clear the bridge around 1 p.m., Wilcox's troops will be advanced And once on the advance, the 100th Pennsylvania Infantry will be thrown forward as a skirmish line. You can kind of see their extended line here on this map. That's because they're working forward as that thin line of troops, skirmish line. And they're going to do a good job within that role. In fact, there's a nice sketch, Alfred Watt sketch there of a skirmish line, what that would look like. But we advanced to the top of the hill above the bridge. We commenced on sharpshooting. Commenced on the sharpshooters who were behind a stone wall. We soon made them leave. The batteries still kept sending shell, grape, and canister shot and chunks of railroad iron amongst us. Robert Lee has very little left manpower wise in this part of the field when the 9th Corps is rolling forward in what's known as the final attack. That attack that began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and would culminate at the end of the day. But he has a heck of a lot of firepower down there. By the end of the day, he's going to have around 40 cannon deployed in the southern end of the battlefield, hammering that federal line, trying to slow it down any way possible. That quote came from Corporal Frederick of the 100th Pennsylvania Infantry. That's an image of him. And again, interestingly enough, the Roundheads also are one of the few units that actually get into the very edges of Sharpsburg and have a little bit of minor urban fighting, if you will, and one of the mills just on the southern edge of town. And we don't really hear much about that with the Battle of Antietam. We normally think of things like Fredericksburg, famously, even Gettysburg and whatnot. But there is just a little bit of urban fighting at the very southern edge of Sharpsburg, and the 100th PA is involved with that. By 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening, the bloodiest day was over. Nearly 23,000 men had fallen, killed, wounded, and missing in action. On September 18th, both armies remained in place on the field and were preparing to continue the fight. Both Lee and McClellan believed that this battle would continue. But on around midday on September 18th, Lee is also very carefully, quietly going to begin to prepare his forces to withdraw. He begins to send his wagon train westward. He begins to send his wounded westward. And that evening, he actually prepares his line of battle, which he's drawn back a little bit. He's actually pulled it back from the Sharpsburg Ridge to Real Ridge, so that it's out of the long-range fire of federal forces on the other side of the Antietam. He's preparing his battle line to withdraw. One account has him ordering bonfires built along the line, and then once sundown occurs, those troops around those fires simply slip away. One of the great accusations against George McClellan is that there was no pursuit of Lee's army. Well, we know that's not the case. McClellan absolutely does pursue Robert E. Lee. We would have federal cavalry pound through Sharpsburg on the 19th. They're capturing stragglers, they're capturing wounded men, they capture a cannon that is broken down on its way to the Potomac River. And once they reach the Potomac River, where the Confederate Army has withdrawn across to the opposite side back into Virginia, what is waiting for them? 44 pieces of Confederate artillery, a Confederate rear guard. And so on the 19th of September, we would have a really protracted artillery duel because the cavalry calls forward its own support, its own artillery, and the United States 5th Corps, the freshest troops on the battlefield, specifically Morrell's division, would be advanced to the Potomac River. And on the 20th, we would have what's known as the Battle of Shepherdstown. Mostly an artillery duel on the 19th, but we actually have an infantry advance late in the day on the 19th. And on the 20th, federal forces advance once again, attempting to be a toehold onto the Virginia side. The 67th Pennsylvania does write about this. It's one of the regiments that's initially advanced across the river. On the morning of the 20th, our regiment, accompanied by the 4th Michigan, made reconnaissance into Virginia, crossing at Shepherd's Ford to ascertain if the retreat was complete. And initially, it appears to be so. The 62nd Pennsylvania, the 4th Michigan, most of its support simply withdraw unmolested back to the Maryland side and report what they've found. Unfortunately for the 5th Corps, for Morrell's division, other federal troops would be advanced, and famously the 118th Pennsylvania infantry, the Corn Exchange Regiment, is badly cut up later in the day at the fighting of Shepherdstown. But both of our Western Pennsylvania regiments get away from that fight unscathed. The 83rd, Pennsylvania also comments on Shepherdstown. The head of the 83rd had scarcely got halfway across when we were ordered back to position in the canal. At that moment, the firing commenced. So the 83rd was potentially going into action there at Shepherdstown when they're ordered back to the canal side, back to the Maryland side of the river, and they're only able to assist their comrades in arms with long-range fire across the river. So let's wrap things up by looking at the cost, specifically the cost of Western Pennsylvania here during the Maryland campaign. For our PA Reserve regiments, these are the casualties for both South Mountain and for Antietam in this case. They take significant losses over the course of this period. 402 men cut down from the PA Reserves. The 62nd and 83rd Pennsylvania, both of them extremely lucky for the Maryland campaign, be it Antietam or Shepherdstown. They actually did not receive any losses during this period. The 100th Pennsylvania Infantry, 53 killed, wounded, missing in action. 111th Pennsylvania and 125th Pennsylvania are both extremely cut up. 110 losses in the 111th, 46% casualties to that regiment. 125th Pennsylvania, remember, big regiment, 700 men, 145 losses, 21% casualties. A fifth of the number of troops they brought into that fight. So, total losses to Western Pennsylvania alone at Antietam is 710 men. Striking losses, and a testament to the duty that this state and this portion of the state would give to the federal war effort during the Maryland campaign. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today about this topic. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. If anyone is interested, I do have, as John Eric said, copies of my books in the back. But again, thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
What happens to the bodies of these people? Who stays behind to bury, taken anywhere?
That's an excellent question. The question was, what happens to the remains? What happens to the bodies of those who fall on these fields? And in this case, the Army of the Potomac actually stays in the area of Sharpsburg for several weeks. They are going to begin cleanup operations from the Battle of Antietam, from the fight at South Mountain, Shepherdstown, in the days immediately following the battle. In fact, fascinatingly, we have all of these pretty brutal images from the Battle of Antietam taken by Alexander Gardner and James Gibson. They are taking those photos as the burial parties have begun. In fact, that's why most of the dead of those images are actually Confederate dead. There's a couple of images where you think they might be Federals having been dragged into position for burial on the field. And that's what happened to most of these guys. They're buried pretty close to where they fell. But the vast majority of the dead taking those images are Confederates because the photographers arrived 2 days after the fight, and most of the Federal dead are already underground with that. Now, there is a secondary portion of that story, of course, is that this is all farmland. And these farmers eventually are going to want their fields back. And they're going to petition the state of Maryland to do something about all of these dead. There's over 4,000 corpses initially from the Battle of Antietam. And we're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, more perish in the coming weeks and months. Remember, some of the field hospitals remain around Sharpsburg until January of '63. So there is months where they're going to have the opportunity for more dead to accumulate. Not to mention the 1,200 some odd horses that were killed there. They are going to petition Maryland to do something about these remains. And in 1866 and 67, the majority of the dead are disinterred from the battlefield and placed in Antietam National Cemetery. The cemetery officially opened in 1867. Confederate dead, however, remained on the field until the early 1870s. They would later be disinterred and placed in several different Confederate cemeteries, including Elmwood and Shepherdstown. Rose Hill is the big one up in Hagerstown, Maryland, and then there's a handful that are in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick as well. So a long answer, does that kind of? Very good. Yes.
Are there any statistics as to like how many people in the north joined the Confederacy, like fought in the Confederacy?
Oh, interesting question. Are there any statistics about how many folks from the north joined the Confederacy to fight? That is a very interesting question, and I can honestly tell you, I don't know. I do not know if there's been a real good statistical analysis to determine that. We do know that the closer you are to the Potomac River, there's more of a chance of you going south. But we see that on both sides. Remember, you got a lot of Western Virginia folks who go north over the river and join the Pennsylvania units at the beginning of the war, before West Virginia becomes its own thing. We see that all across that line, though, well into the Western theater, with Ohio, with Kentucky, Missouri as its own little micro civil war going on within the larger Civil War. So that is happening on both sides, north and south. Of course, famously, we've got a Pennsylvanian, I don't know if you guys still claim him, that's commanding Confederate forces at Vicksburg, Hamilton. He married south. A lot of these guys who are, you wouldn't think, well, why are they fighting for the Confederacy? Well, they married into a Southern family. But I do apologize, I don't have a specific statistic.
We were just at Chickasee, Virginia, and we learned that that little peninsula that goes down there, they actually joined during the Civil War. If you go to the people who slaves there, they didn't care.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yes, sir.
You want to mention, the map that was, burial map there.
Yes, sir.
You want to mention?
The Elliott map, yes. So that was only recently discovered a few years back, I should say rediscovered. The library in New York knew they had it, they just didn't know exactly where it was. But it came up in a digitization project. And the Elliott burial map, which is the same gentleman who did the burial map for Gettysburg, he also did a burial map for Antietam. And so there is roughly, gosh, it says it on Antietam's website. I want to say it's just shy of 5,000 marked graves on that burial map, showing the distribution of the dead on the battlefield landscape. I actually was planning on including it in this lecture, but the little tick marks are so small, you can't really tell what is what on it for when you blow it up like this. Yes, sir.
The 62nd page.
Sir.
Am I correct that Company H commanded originally by Thomas SP, part of the 62nd?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe that is the case.
Was raised in Bethel, Virginia.
Yes, I believe you're right, sir.
And two, the 9th Pennsylvania Reserve Company E, it's named Chartiers Valley. Do you know anything about that?
I don't off the top of my head. I'd be happy to dig into it for you.
Apparently would have been raised right here as well.
It sounds like it, yes.
We're both very much.
Right, they definitely were in the thick of it, you're absolutely right. Especially the 1988 reserves, they were really in the thick of it up at Cornfields. If you'd like, I'd be happy to do a little digging for you, but there is, excuse me, there's some great resources out there on the PA reserves that should be able to provide a lot of that for you. John?
We had a few questions from our Zoom audience.
Great.
Michael would like to know, of the regiments that you discussed, do you happen to know how many of those troops or companies came from Allegheny County here?
Off the top of my head, Michael, I apologize, I didn't think to actually break it down like that, and I do apologize, because that would be a good stat to know. What I would recommend, there's a great history of the PA Reserves. It's written shortly after the war. I did lean into that quite a bit for this research, and they break down the regiments by company. So I do recommend that if you're interested in those sorts of statistics. And of course, as I just said, there's a lot of other good PA Reserve resources out there. A lot of them you can find for free on archive.com, the Library of Congress, and so forth and so on.
And then Emily asked, well, she said, great program.
Thank you.
She said, was Burnside's bridge named after him as a burn because of how long it took to capture the bridge and then get pushed back to it by the fight's end?
Right. It was not, it was known as the Rohrbaugh Bridge, or the Lower Bridge originally, and then because it's his forces, the United States Ninth Corps that take it, it becomes known as Burnside Bridge. I do like the twist on the name though, is that he's actually using it as a burn. I honestly give Burnside more credit than he's traditionally been given, and I think a lot of my colleagues in the battlefield guides and in the Park Service are realizing just how difficult that was. We gotta remember, it was a 10-foot wide bridge. The Antietam Creek was not as shallow as it's oftentimes portrayed. And Confederate forces at that bridge essentially bracketed. Now, there's not a ton of Confederates there, only about 400 to 450, but those Georgians only have to defend a 10-foot wide bridge. So getting across that bridge was not gonna be an easy feat, and they do it in about 3 hours, they take it, which is pretty good. And then because it is such a narrow crossing point, and the fact that the rest of the Federalists have gone down the river to cross the Snavely's Ford, it will take them about 2 hours to get the entire Ninth Corps in a line of battle. But at that point, you've got 8,000 Federal troops in a mile-long battle line that begins that long turn northward to begin the final attack. So a little bit more love for Burnside than he sometimes gets, but I don't think he does quite as badly as is often portrayed. Yes, sir.
Question on your opening slide, which was a frame of, would that be the point of view, street of the
Oh, on the very opening slide?
opening slide?
That is, well, it's funny, because I've seen that painting portrayed as supposedly it's the Iron Brigade, supposedly it's the 125th Pennsylvania, supposedly it's Irwin's Brigade from the 6th Corps. So there's a lot of folks who claim it's different units in that. So it could be any number of them, but I liked that it was showing that movement right in front of the Dunkirk Church where the 125th was. So that's why I chose it for the kind of title page. But if there are no other questions, you guys were pretty easy on me. I appreciate that. Thank you once again for having me.
Well, thank you for coming out, everyone. Feel free to speak with Matt here in the back of the room, take home a book with you, and then we'll see you back here next month, October 11th, for Jonathan Noyalis. If anyone would like to talk about the SB post, about the symposium, anything else, feel free to come see me. Thank you.
Gonna find my ticket.
All right, we can do that.